Okay, let's unpack this. You know how sometimes people claim that systematic Satanism, meaning like a structured, defined religious or philosophical belief system around Satan or Lucifer, didn't really exist in any meaningful way before Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in 1966.
Right, that's the common narrative.
Well, get ready to have that idea challenged, maybe even completely upended, because this deep dive goes deep into a surprising figure who is definitely talking about the cult of Satan Lucifer decades before LaVey was even born.
Indeed. Our subject today isn't a well-known historical figure. He's far more obscure. A man who, by day, worked as a dairy salesman in Denmark, but dedicated his life to alchemical pursuits and a very particular form of Luciferianism.
A dairy salesman. Okay.
Yeah. His name was Carl William Hansen, born in 1872, and he wrote under the esoteric name Ben Kadosh.
Ben Kadosh. It has a real ring to it, doesn't it? Sounds like someone you'd find mentioned in hushed tones in old occult books.
It does have that air about it.
And the source material for this deep dive is absolutely fascinating. It's an academic article by Faxneld titled The Strange Case of Ben Kadosh, a Luciferian pamphlet from 1906 and its current renaissance. What's so compelling about this article is that it's not just summarizing existing knowledge, it's revealing an almost entirely forgotten corner of esoteric history and showing how it's having an unexpected impact today.
Precisely. Our mission in this deep dive is to really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this article. We're going to understand who this obscure figure was, delve into his truly bizarre and unique ideas about Lucifer, Pan, and the universe, explore his strange life and the peculiar people he interacted with,
Okay.
and then, critically, look at how a modern group is actually reviving his legacy right now. And we're sticking strictly to the details provided only in this article.
Right, just the Faxneld piece. It sounds like we're peeling back a layer of history that most people, even those interested in occult history, have never seen. What kind of wild ride should you, our listener, expect on this journey?
Well, prepare for a deep dive into a complex blend of Gnosticism, elements borrowed from Freemasonry, ancient Pan worship, alchemical philosophy, and Kadosh's own idiosyncratic interpretations of all of them.
Wow.
Centered around a figure he calls the world's master builder, who happens to be Lucifer.
Lucifer is the master builder, okay.
We'll uncover the details of his life, the unusual contacts he made in the esoteric world, and then track how, against all odds, his ideas are finding a renaissance today.
All right, let's not wait any longer. Let's jump in and unpack the strange case of Ben Kadosh.
So, Part 1, the man behind the Luciferian dawn. Let's start with his origins. Carl William Hansen was born in Copenhagen in 1872.
Right.
The article makes it clear he came from a genuinely poor working-class background. This is a crucial detail because it contrasts quite sharply with the grand titles and international connections he would later claim.
That makes sense. So real poverty.
Oh, yes. His mother, for example, began receiving welfare from the state when Kadosh was only 9 years old. And the support wasn't temporary. She remained reliant on state welfare from 1898 until her death in 1917, with the state even covering her funeral costs. This wasn't a family with resources or connections.
That really puts his later esoteric aspirations into perspective. It speaks to a potential drive or ambition to transcend difficult circumstances, perhaps finding status or meaning in the esoteric world that was unavailable to him otherwise.
It certainly could. Yet, despite this poverty, he did acquire some education.
Okay, so he wasn't uneducated.
No, he managed to get enough education that by his late 20s, he was working as a bookkeeper. It's a practical, grounded profession.
Like bookkeeper, right.
But the article quickly shifts to his entry into the esoteric world, noting he was initiated into L'Ordre Martiniste, a French esoteric society founded by Papists.
The Martinists. Papists.
Which, the source points out, was just the first of many, many societies he would become involved with throughout his life. This was clearly where his true passion lay, even if he had to work a day job.
Now, the article inserts a note of caution here regarding his numerous claimed affiliations, which I found quite revealing.
Yes, it does. While Kadosh himself claimed extensive international initiations in places like Lyon, Berlin, and Vienna.
Pretty impressive list.
It is. But the author, per Faxneld, expresses potential doubt about whether he truly received all of these in person. Why? Because the cost of travel to and from these cities would have been prohibitive for someone from his economic background.
The money aspect. Makes sense.
It's a small detail, but it grounds his claims in the reality of his circumstances. The source even recounts an anecdote where a commentator wryly noted Kadosh didn't dismiss the idea of acquiring a Chinese Masonic patent when asked, but nothing came of it.
A Chinese Masonic patent.
Yeah, with the commentators suggesting maybe a language barrier was the issue. It hints at a potential gap between the grandeur of his esoteric claims and the practicalities of his life.
It introduces this fascinating tension. Was he a genuine initiate or perhaps someone exaggerating his connections? Or maybe a bit of both?
Could be. Either way, his commitment led to his most significant public act in the esoteric world, the publication of his pamphlet in 1906.
Right, that pamphlet. This is key.
Exactly. That key work is titled Denny Morgens Grij, Verdens Begmesterens Genkomst.
Which translates to?
The Dawn of a New Morning, the Return of the World's Master Builder.
The title alone is loaded, particularly the world's master builder, which immediately resonates with Masonic symbolism, hinting at the direction his unique theology will take.
Definitely. But the article's description of the pamphlet style is perhaps its most infamous characteristic.
Infamous. How so?
Infamous is a good word for it. The source doesn't pull any punches. It's described as unstructured, highly eccentric, original, and confusing.
So not exactly easy reading.
Not at all. Commentators from his own time and later scholars agree that Kadosh was deliberately obscure in his writing. The article provides a quote from one contemporary description that really nails it. It is written in a rather muddled language, and when the author in addition evidently has tried to give his words an abstruse oracular disguise, one understands that for the non-illuminated, i.e. the non-initiated, it is difficult to comprehend.
Abstruse oracular disguise. That sounds less like clear teaching and more like channeling something intentionally difficult to grasp. Why do you think he chose to be so obscure?
Well, the source doesn't explicitly state Kadosh's motive for the obscurity, but in esoteric traditions, difficult language and veiled meanings are often used to protect teachings from the uninitiated.
Okay, keep it secret.
Or to force the reader into a state of contemplation that unlocks deeper understanding. However, in Kadosh's case, some descriptions suggest it might also have simply been, well, badly written. A manuscript from a Masonic lodge from around his time is quoted using even harsher language, an incredibly affected and partly incomprehensible language, an unreadable and hopelessly incorrect language.
Unreadable and hopelessly incorrect language. Ouch. That makes it sound less like intentional mystical veiling and more like just confusing.
The source notes that the result, regardless of intent, is a very high risk of misinterpretation for anyone trying to understand his work. This wasn't a text designed for mass appeal or easy digestion.
Yet, despite the challenging prose, he had a very clear goal for publishing it.
He did. Kadosh himself was explicit about the pamphlet's purpose. It was intended for the spreading of the cult of Satan Lucifer.
Okay, explicitly Satan Lucifer.
Yes, and for the recruitment of proselytes, and for the formation of a closed circle, almost under the form of a new esoteric order of Freemasons, which should be fully dedicated to a cult similar to that of the ancients.
Okay, so right there, in 1906, you have a stated intention to create a structured esoteric order specifically dedicated to a cult of Satan Lucifer, explicitly linking it to Freemasonry and ancient cults. That is incredibly significant for anyone who thinks systematic Satanism is a purely modern phenomenon.
It really is.
It directly contradicts the idea that this kind of organized, text-based Luciferianism didn't exist before the mid-20th century.
It's a key piece of evidence unearthed by this article, pushing the timeline back considerably, even if Kadosh and his group remained extremely obscure in their time.
Which leads us into part 2, Kadosh's unique theology of Lucifer and Pam. This is where things get truly strange and original.
Absolutely. His core claim at the outset is that Satan and Lucifer are totally alien to the Christian teaching.
Okay, so separating them from Christianity entirely.
Yes. He asserts they belong only to esoteric cult and magic. He's essentially saying that the Christian understanding of the devil is a distortion. The true meaning and power of these figures are found only in ancient and occult traditions.
Interesting take.
And his definition of Lucifer is unlike any conventional Christian or even most esoteric depictions. It's complex and multi-layered. He defines Lucifer as the sum or ego of the material nature, the creating logon and force.
The sum of material nature. What does that mean exactly?
It's like the essential consciousness or driving principle behind the physical world. He sees this entity as both personal and impersonal, a true physical reality, though of a semi-material nature.
Semi-material.
Yeah, kind of bridging the physical and non-physical. And he calls Lucifer the potency of the forces in living matter, in an individually personified form, the sum of the creating nature.
So he's not just a fallen angel or a symbol of evil. He's the principle of material creation, the very energy and consciousness inherent in physical reality personified. He's a cosmic force that is also somehow an individual entity. It's a very different concept.
It's a unique synthesis, definitely. And he wasn't just writing theory. Kadosh asserted that with the necessary keys or knowledge, presumably the knowledge contained within his pamphlet and his order, it was possible to evoke this entity, this Lucifer.
He claimed you could summon Lucifer.
Yes. And here's one of those striking, almost unbelievable details from the article. The pamphlet actually included a direct invitation. Interested individuals were encouraged to call on Kadosh personally at his home address, Schieringade 29 in Copenhagen.
You're kidding. So you read this incredibly dense, obscure pamphlet about evoking the world's master builder, and at the end it's basically like, for more information or to schedule an evocation, call Carl at this address.
Pretty much.
That adds a layer of almost mundane reality to his cosmic claims. It makes him seem incredibly accessible, or perhaps incredibly confident, or maybe just lonely.
Slight chuckle. It certainly makes him seem less like a remote mystical guru and more like a local eccentric running an occult practice out of his home. It's a detail that really brings the man into focus amidst the abstract theology.
Definitely. Now let's look at some of the bold, controversial connections Kadosh makes in his system.
Okay. He quotes Karl Kohl, a contemporary writer on occult topics, and draws inspiration from Kohl's summary of Gnosticism. Using Kohl's description, Kadosh views his goat god, which we'll discuss shortly, as a demiurge, the father and creator of this world, the material universe we inhabit.
Okay, let's pause on the demiurge concept for a second, just to clarify. In traditional Gnosticism, the demiurge is usually seen as an inferior, often malevolent or ignorant, creator god who mistakenly believes himself to be the supreme deity.
Right, trapping spirits in matter.
Trapping spiritual beings in the material world. The goal in Gnosticism is often to escape the demiurge's creation and return to the true, higher God. Kadosh is saying his Lucifer demiurge is the creator of this world, but his view of this figure seems positive.
Exactly, that's a crucial point of departure. While he uses the Gnostic term demiurge, his conception is radically different from the typical Gnostic understanding where the demiurge is a problem to be overcome. And then he takes it even further, making a connection that the source emphasizes is not traditional in Masonry. He identifies Satan Lucifer with the grand architect Hiram Abiff from Masonic lore.
Hiram Abiff, the temple builder.
That's the one. The source explicitly states this is a novel invention of Kadosh's.
That's a massive leap. In traditional Freemasonry, the grand architect of the universe, often symbolized by Hiram Abiff as the master builder of Solomon's temple, is generally understood as the supreme being, God. Kadosh completely repurposes that symbol.
Totally flips it.
Identifying the master builder of the material world, not with God, but with Satan Lucifer.
It's a bold reinterpretation. The article explores potential influences for this highly specific, non-Masonic connection between Hiram and Satan. One possibility it raises is the infamous French hoaxer Leo Taxil.
Taxil, the anti-Masonic hoax guy.
Exactly. He created elaborate anti-Catholic conspiracy theories claiming Freemasonry was secretly satanic. Taxil's fabricated rituals often depicted Hiram being crowned by Satan. Kadosh might have encountered this idea through Karl Kohl's writings, which summarized Taxil's claims.
That's incredibly ironic. Kadosh potentially incorporated an element from a known fraud designed to mock Freemasonry and Catholicism into his own serious esoteric system.
It is ironic. The source notes the peculiarity that Kadosh seems to have adopted some of Taxil's fantasies, despite Kohl explaining that Taxil's work was a scam.
So maybe he didn't care it was a scam, or didn't believe it.
It suggests Kadosh might have been drawing on information uncritically, or perhaps saw something symbolic or useful in Taxil's bizarre claims, regardless of their origin. Another potential influence mentioned is from the French writer Jules Bois, also discussed by Kohl.
Okay.
Bois described a satanic temple with Lucifer above the altar, referred to as the world's builder, and importantly, a footnote in that description connected the Masonic grand architect to the Gnostic demiurge Satan.
So he might have encountered the idea of Lucifer as the world's builder, linked to both Gnosticism and Masonic concepts through Bois' work, and then independently linked that figure to Hiram based on other sources like the Taxil material or his own intuition.
It seems he was a synthesis, pulling disparate threads from contemporary esoteric and anti-esoteric literature, filtering them through his own unique vision.
Right.
And this brings us back to the source's description of Kadosh's Lucifer demiurge as an entirely original and odd figure. It truly deviates from standard esoteric ideas. As we discussed, traditional Gnosticism sees the demiurge as negative.
You're the bad guy.
Right. Most Gnostic-inspired Satanism identifies the Christian God as the evil demiurge, whom Satan opposes as a figure of liberation. Kadosh's view, where Lucifer is the benevolent, or at least approachable demiurge, the actual creator of this world, stands alone.
It's a complete inversion of many common satanic narratives.
Yeah.
Instead of opposing the creator, Kadosh as Lucifer as the creator, just misunderstood and maligned by Christianity.
That seems to be his angle.
He also portrays Lucifer as a guide, but a rebellious and criminal initiator. What does that imply?
It suggests Lucifer is the one who offers access to forbidden or hidden knowledge, the mysteries that the Christian Church, in Kadosh's view, deliberately concealed to keep humanity enslaved in ignorance.
The light bringer, but in a criminal way.
Kind of. Lucifer, the rebel, is the one who breaks down barriers and grants enlightenment. Kadosh also describes him as a phallic and expansive personification of energy, the nemesis of all attempts to confine and limit.
That sounds very much like a vitalistic concept, a focus on life force and dynamic energy.
Exactly. This vitalistic element connects his ideas to contemporary currents of thought. You see echoes of LFS LaVey's identification of Baphomet with the astral light.
LaVey's Baphomet, right?
Which LaVey understood as a kind of cosmic energy or life force permeating everything. It also ties into the broader interest in vitalism that was prominent in the 19th and early 20th centuries, stemming from earlier figures like Franz Mesmer with animal magnetism and Karl Reichenbach with odic force. Kadosh is clearly tapping into these concepts of invisible, potent energies underlying reality.
So Lucifer is the principle of creative energy, rebellion against limitation, and the source of hidden knowledge. Is there a higher god in Kadosh's system, or is Lucifer the ultimate?
Good question. The article explains there is another layer to his theology. Kadosh posits that Lucifer's father is an even higher entity, the unpronounceable source of all life.
The unpronounceable source.
That which language does not have any understandable, pronounceable word for. This is similar to the concept of an unknowable, transcendent God in some mystical traditions. Lucifer, in Kadosh's system, is the expression of the unpronounceable, the vessel, the necessary intermediary through which this ultimate, hidden God can be approached or known.
So Lucifer isn't the highest deity, but he's the only way to access the highest deity. The cult, therefore, should focus on the worship and adoration of an eternal, hidden, mighty, or omnipotent force in nature. That ultimate unknowable source, but accessed through Lucifer.
Exactly. And from Kadosh's perspective, Christianity's depiction of Lucifer as ugly and evil is a tragic misrepresentation that prevents people from accessing this path to the true divine.
It makes sense within his system.
He even adds a detail about Lucifer's appearance, noting that he is not ugly, but in fact he is beautiful in his dark apparent obscenity.
Beautiful in his dark apparent obscenity. That's a striking and provocative image, capturing the paradox he sees in Lucifer appearing dark and perhaps unsettling from a conventional perspective, but possessing a hidden beauty and truth.
Very well put. And this brings us to the other major figure in his theology, explicitly linked to Lucifer, Pan.
Pan, the goat god.
Right. Right at the beginning of his pamphlet, Kadosh includes an invocation of Pan taken from an ancient Orphic hymn. And throughout the text, Lucifer Satan is explicitly equated with Pan. A key theme is the resurrection of the no longer dead great god Pan.
The great god Pan is dead was a famous phrase associated with the end of the pagan world. Kadosh is declaring his return and saying he is Lucifer.
He is creating a powerful synthesis. For Kadosh, the Greek goat god of wild nature and the light-bringing rebellious figure of Lucifer are one and the same expression of that cosmic, vital energy.
So Pan, Lucifer, kills creative energy.
Pretty much. And his description of Pan isn't purely classical. The source notes features like wings on Pan's back, showing he's synthesizing elements of the Greek Pan, the Christian devil, often depicted with bat wings, and LaVey's Baphomet, which is often winged.
Okay, so a composite figure. The equation of Pan with Satan or the devil wasn't entirely unprecedented in Western thought, right?
No, it has a history, largely due to Pan's goat features aligning with Christian iconography of the devil. The source mentions this tradition, citing figures like Eusebius in the 3rd century who viewed Pan as a demon.
Okay.
Lambaudin in the 16th century who called him the Prince of Incubi, and the Cambridge Platonist Henry More in the 17th century who connected Pan to the devil present at witches' sabbaths.
So the link was there, historically.
Yes. So Kadosh wasn't inventing that link from scratch, but he was using it as a cornerstone of a positive Luciferian theology.
And Pan was experiencing something of a cultural moment around Kadosh's time, wasn't he? In literature and art.
He was very popular, yeah. particularly poetry and prose during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Think of figures like Keats, Shelley, Swinburne, Oscar Wilde. Occultists like Aleister Crowley are also deeply interested in Pan,
Crowley definitely was.
writing poems dedicated to him and even developing a cult of Pan. Kadosh's fascination with Pan was, in that sense, quite typical for the esoteric and artistic circles of the era.
The source also points to an older influence on the perception of Pan.
Yes, the antique misunderstanding that linked Pan's name to the Greek word for all, leading to the philosophical view of Pan as the soul of the world, the animating principle of the cosmos.
Pan as all.
Right. This ancient idea clearly resonated with Kadosh's concept of Lucifer as the sum or ego of material nature.
And the article highlights a very specific literary parallel.
It does. There's a striking similarity between Kadosh's phrasing about Pan and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's description in his Biographia Literaria from 1817.
Coleridge.
Interesting. Coleridge described Pan as intelligence blended with a darker power, deeper, mightier, and more universal than the conscious intellect of man.
Wow.
Kadosh's description of Lucifer Pan as the sum of material nature, both personal and impersonal, a force deeper than conscious thought, aligns remarkably well with Coleridge's formulation. It suggests Kadosh might have encountered or echoed the specific vitalistic view of Pan.
That quote perfectly encapsulates the kind of primal, all-encompassing force Kadosh seems to be worshiping. It's a powerful synthesis, blending classical myth, Christian demonology, esoteric vitalism, and potentially even contemporary literature like Coleridge's.
Moving into part 3, let's shift from his unique theology to Kadosh the man and his interactions with the world around him, which were often as strange as his ideas.
Okay, the man himself.
Much of the personal information we have about him comes from a memorial article written by his friend, the Danish writer Age Welblund, published in 1946.
And Welblund provides some truly memorable anecdotes that flesh out the image of this eccentric figure. My absolute favorite is the story about Kadosh approaching the Society for Psychical Research.
Oh, yes.
A respectable academic body investigating paranormal phenomena, asking them to help him summon a salamander.
A salamander, yes, the fire elemental in alchemical lore. This anecdote shows Kadosh wasn't just writing abstract theology, he was attempting practical magic, or at least believed it was possible.
Right, hands-on stuff.
And he wasn't afraid to approach established institutions, however unlikely their assistance might be, to help him achieve his goals.
It paints a picture of someone very earnest in his magical pursuits, perhaps lacking a bit of social grace or understanding of how such institutions worked.
Possibly. Beyond attempting to summon elementals, Kadosh also had fascinating personal contacts within the intellectual and artistic world of his time.
Like who?
Yes. Notably, he corresponded with the famous Swedish author, playwright, and occasional alchemist, August Strindberg.
Strindberg, known for plays like Miss Julie and his own intense, often troubled, spiritual and alchemical explorations. What did they discuss?
Unfortunately, their actual letters to each other are lost. However, their correspondence is documented in other letters that Strindberg wrote.
Okay, so we know what happened.
Yes. The article notes that Strindberg mentioned Kadosh in his letters, and there were tensions in their relationship. Strindberg, who was also experimenting with alchemy, complained about the secrecy surrounding Kadosh's pleas for money to fund his gold-making experiments.
The money again.
Which Strindberg suspected smacked of humbug and charlatanism.
That highlights a key divergence, doesn't it? Strindberg was trying to use more scientific methods in his alchemy, while Kadosh saw it through a purely esoteric lens.
Precisely. The article notes that their main disagreement centered on this point. Kadosh firmly grounded his alchemy in esoteric speculation, seeing it as a spiritual process tied to his Luciferian philosophy. Strindberg, while certainly mystical, wanted to apply the methods of natural science to alchemical processes.
Very different goals.
And as we mentioned earlier, Kadosh's text states that alchemical gold is Lucifer, or at least closely tied to him, making gold-making a Luciferian quest for enlightenment, a very different goal from Strindberg's apparent desire to simply create actual physical gold.
So Strindberg wasn't looking to make Lucifer gold. He was looking to solve his financial problems.
It seems that way. Kadosh didn't get funding from Strindberg, but he did find a financier in a Danish nobleman who was facing financial difficulties and was perhaps desperate enough to try alchemy.
A desperate nobleman. Okay.
The nobleman reportedly allowed Kadosh to set up a huge oven in the basement of his estate to conduct his experiments.
Did Kadosh finally achieve his alchemical breakthrough there?
Right.
Turn lead into gold?
According to Kadosh, he was incredibly close. He claimed he was just on the verge of a major breakthrough that would solve the age-old riddle of gold transmutation when the nobleman, perhaps running out of patience or money, kicked him out.
Always just about to succeed.
Exactly. The article adds, with characteristic dry wit, that whether this breakthrough would have actually helped the nobleman pay off his debts is another matter.
It reinforces that pattern of grand claims, practical difficulties, and an unwavering belief in being on the cusp of success. He also corresponded with other authors.
Yes, he also corresponded with the Austrian author Gustav Meyrink, known for his esoteric novel Der Golem.
Meyrink, right.
Sadly, these letters too are lost, preventing deeper insight into their discussions. Authors and occultists weren't the only notable people he met. He apparently made a point of visiting Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, when Steiner was in Copenhagen.
And Steiner, a renowned clairvoyant and spiritual teacher himself, supposedly had a memorable reaction to Kadosh.
The anecdote, as recounted in the source, is that Kadosh visited Steiner in his Copenhagen hotel room to discuss esoteric topics. Steiner reportedly commented later that surrounding Kadosh's person there was an aura that fully revealed that he was in communication with the powers of darknesses.
That's a powerful, if chilling, assessment coming from someone like Steiner. It suggests that Kadosh's connection to darker powers was palpable, even to another prominent esoteric figure.
It's quite a statement.
This encounter certainly must have contributed to the rather sinister reputation Kadosh acquired.
It did. Sinister stories definitely circulated about him. One persistent rumor was that he could magically attack his enemies regardless of distance.
Psychic attacks.
Apparently. The source notes that Kadosh apparently enjoyed these rumors and did nothing to discourage them, perhaps seeing them as enhancing his mystique or power. His friend Wellblund, while perhaps trying to be balanced, confirmed there was a dark streak in Kadosh's personality, particularly evident when he did horoscope readings. Wellblund noted that Kadosh had a very sharp eye for people's weak sides, suggesting this talent was linked to his predilection for the dark and disharmonic side of things.
So he wasn't just eccentric. He seemed to genuinely engage with and perhaps exploit the darker aspects of life and people.
It sounds a bit like that. And the article mentions an even more disturbing detail, a passing reference in another source to psychic experiments Kadosh performed where intervention was needed to avoid a murder and a suicide.
Whoa. Murder and suicide, that's serious.
It suggests his activities could, at times, have extremely serious, potentially dangerous consequences, moving far beyond mere theoretical speculation or quirky experiments with ovens.
Goodness. That adds a much darker hue to the picture of the eccentric dairy salesman. Given his pamphlet, the rumors, and these alarming anecdotes, he achieved a degree of public infamy in his own time, didn't he?
Yes, he became known, at least in certain circles. His pamphlet itself drew attention, and articles were written about him. The source mentions one particularly notable newspaper piece by Carl Kohl titled, "Are There Satanists in Copenhagen?"
Catchy title.
Wellblund, in his memorial article, quotes directly from Kohl's piece, providing a specific, vivid detail about Kadosh's perceived practices.
What does that quote capture?
It describes how a Danish Satanist, strongly implied to be Kadosh, celebrates Christmas. While the rest of Europe celebrates for the White Christ, this Satanist says, while Europe celebrates Christmas for the White Christ, I celebrate it as a feast for the highest one, the Buck's Head. A fest for Baphomet, the hidden divinity, whom I worship and worship again.
A fest for Baphomet, the hidden divinity. That quote is incredibly powerful. It encapsulates his defiant posture against Christianity and his clear commitment to his unique Luciferian Baphomet pan-synthesis.
It really does.
And to think, this was potentially being enacted within the context of his home life.
Yes, the article provides a picture of his home life that is quite a contrast to the grand esoteric claims. His wife ran a small dairy store out of their home to support the family.
So she was the breadwinner.
It seems so. While Kadosh devoted his time to his occult activities and experiments, they lived in a small apartment, and he even attempted practical manufacturing, like trying to make typewriter color bands in the kitchen, apparently unsuccessfully.
So downstairs, Mrs. Hansen is selling butter and cheese to the neighbors, while upstairs, Mr. Hansen is in the kitchen trying to manufacture office supplies, or maybe in the attic wrestling with invisible forces, perhaps disturbing the customers below.
That latter image comes from literary portrayals of Kadosh, which the source notes help preserve his legend in Denmark. He was depicted in novels by fellow countrymen like J.I. Kronstrom and J. Anker Larsen.
And most famously, the article highlights, by the celebrated Danish author Hans Scherfig in his satirical novel Idealister, The Idealists.
Yes. Scherfig portrays Kadosh, thinly veiled. There's a memorable scene set in the attic room above the dairy store.
Okay, paint the picture.
It depicts Kadosh wildly swinging a cardboard sword he calls shibula, a word with significance in some esoteric systems, related to Freemasonry and Kabbalah, while wearing a hat fashioned from a margarine container decorated with occult symbols.
A margarine container hat. Seriously.
According to Scherfig's depiction, his loud incantations are disturbing the customers downstairs, and his wife comes up to try and calm him down, but he persists, locked in his battle with unseen powers.
That is a vivid, slightly absurd, but incredibly memorable image. And the article confirms that Kadosh's friend Wellblund stated that much of Scherfig's depiction, despite being in a satirical novel, was actually based on fact.
Which makes the image all the more striking and perhaps a little sad. It highlights the difficult reality of his grand aspirations confined within a small, struggling domestic life.
Yeah. Despite the potential for others to see him as simply eccentric or even laughable, Kadosh was clearly deeply serious about his beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. The article presents compelling evidence for this from an official source, the 1906 National Census.
The census.
Yeah.
How is that evidence of his conviction?
In that national census, citizens were required to declare their religious affiliation. While his wife and their 2 children living in the same household answered Lutheran, Carl William Hansen stated his religious affiliation as Luciferian.
Wow. On an official government document, he declared himself a follower of Lucifer in 1906.
Exactly.
That is incredibly powerful evidence of his sincere, deeply held beliefs, setting himself apart not just from society, but even from his own family's stated religion. The source is careful to correct an earlier scholarly finding about the year of this declaration, placing it firmly in 1906, the same year he published his pamphlet.
It underscores that the pamphlet wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It reflected a profound personal commitment. Now, Kadosh did publish a later pamphlet in 1928 titled Rosea Crucis, published anonymously under the pseudonym Fletter, a brother.
Rosicrucian, so Rosicrucian themed.
Seems so. The source notes that this later work is quite different in tone and content. It has no explicit satanic references and uses mostly Christian imagery.
So, did he abandon his Luciferian path later in life, perhaps moving towards a more conventional form of Rosicrucianism?
The source suggests that might not be entirely the case. It argues that the language used regarding God in the later pamphlet, such as the exhortation to direct the flame within you towards God, is general enough that it could potentially be interpreted as referring back to the master builder Lucifer of the first pamphlet.
Ah, Lucifer as the vessel to God.
Understood as the vessel to the ultimate divine. And crucially, the later text ends with the Latin words per tenebris ad lumen,
which means
through darkness towards light.
Through darkness towards light. That phrase resonates deeply with his earlier ideas of Satan darkness being the necessary path or intermediary to reach the true hidden godlight.
Exactly.
So even in a text that appears more conventionally Christian or Rosicrucian, he might have embedded echoes of his core Luciferian philosophy veiled in a different language. It suggests a continuity in his underlying thought, even if the external presentation shifted.
Part 4 takes us further into Kadosh's deep involvement in the complex and sometimes confusing world of organized esotericism in his era.
All those orders he joined?
Yes. The article provides an almost dizzying list of titles and affiliations he claimed, as documented in William Hartman's 1927 Who's Who in Occultism.
What does that list look like? Give us a taste.
It's extensive. Chemist, author, Kabbalist, astrologer. Then it gets into the leadership roles. Patriarch and Primus of the Masonic Gnostic Synod, Scandinavia, Grand Master General, the Grand Orient of Denmark, President of the Alchemical Society of Denmark.
Okay, a lot of titles.
General Delegate and Honorable Member of Societa Alchemica Italiana, President of the Kabbalistic Order, Denmark, Grand Master and General Delegate of the Martinist Order, and the list goes on, etc., etc.
Etc., indeed. That's an incredible number of high-ranking positions in various esoteric orders for one person. It paints a picture of someone incredibly active and, at least on paper, very important within the international esoteric network of the time.
It certainly does. The source specifically mentions his membership in Theodore Rees's OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis.
The OTO, okay.
Before Crowley.
Yes, which is notable because this was before Aleister Crowley fully took over and transformed it. Kadosh became the head of the OTO in Denmark.
Was the Danish OTO under Kadosh linked to the system Crowley later developed, like Philema?
No. The source clarifies that under Kadosh's leadership and that of his successor, the Danish OTO never became Crowleyan. It remained its own distinct branch.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, the article notes detailed documentation on Kadosh's practical involvement in the OTO and many of these other numerous groups is difficult to find. So, while he held the titles, the specifics of what he did within these organizations often remained obscure.
Right. Given his core beliefs, did any of these many orders he was involved with share his unique Luciferian leanings? Was he trying to spread his ideas through them?
That's the big question. The source suggests that perhaps the Masonic Gnostic Synod, where he held the titles of Patriarch and Primus, might have been receptive to his ideas. Why them specifically?
The antique Nicenes were a Gnostic sect known for viewing the serpent in the Garden of Eden positively.
Ah, the serpent is good.
Yes, seeing it as a messenger from the true, higher God who opposed the ignorant demiurge creator. Since Kadosh's group drew inspiration from this tradition, which already had a positive view of a figure traditionally seen as negative, the serpent Nakesh, it's plausible they might have been open to his reinterpretation of Lucifer as a benevolent demiurge.
So his Nicenic group might have been the closed circle or Luciferian Gnostic congregation he mentioned in his 1906 pamphlet?
That's a possibility, but the actual size of this Gnostic group is unknown. The source suggests it may have been incredibly small, potentially a minuscule synod of only 1 or 2 people with no actual church infrastructure.
Just him and maybe a friend?
Could be. A manuscript from one of his Masonic lodges, quoted in the article, was quite dismissive, stating his goal was to establish a Luciferian Gnostic congregation with himself as patriarch, but he naturally never managed to.
Naturally never managed to. That sounds like a rival or someone who didn't take him seriously.
It does have that tone. However, the source also considers another possibility for his closed circle, the small occult circle. Slag's occult, Broderskap, a kind of occult brotherhood. He started with 2 other men.
Okay, who were they?
N.A. Westman, a shoemaker interested in perpetual motion machines.
A shoemaker trying to build a perpetual motion machine. Of course.
And Wilhelm Jespersen, an astrology student. They were later joined by the illustrator Niels Wavell. Was this the secret Luciferian clique? The source states that, unfortunately, it's not possible to definitively tell from the available accounts.
So whether his Luciferianism remained a solitary pursuit or found a small, dedicated group of adherents in his lifetime is still an open question, at least based on the evidence presented in this article.
Seems so. The source does mention he might have occasionally tried to subtly introduce his ideas into more conventional settings. Yes, the possibility is raised that he sometimes attempted to insert Luciferian elements into standard Masonic groups. For example, he might have been permitted to invoke the High Demiurge, which, as we've discussed, meant Lucifer in his specific theology, at a seemingly conventional lodge meeting in 1926.
Sneaking his Lucifer demiurge into a regular Masonic meeting, that's quite a maneuver.
He was certainly persistent in navigating these different esoteric currents. However, his extensive involvement with Masonic groups wasn't without its problems. During the 1920s, he was involved in founding several Masonic lodges that, as far as we know, were not Luciferian.
And this eventually led to trouble for him.
Yes. In December 1930, Kadosh was expelled from several of these lodges.
Expelled way.
The reason given was his continued peddling of irregular Masonic charters. This suggests he might have been issuing unrecognized or illegitimate charters for new lodges, which would cause conflict with established Masonic authorities. This seems to have marked a decline in his standing within the formal esoteric community. Host, speaker, speaker. That brings us to a rather poignant moment detailed in the article. His letter to Harvey Spencer Lewis, the founder of the American Rosicrucian Organization, AMORC, in 1931. It's a revealing glimpse into his state of mind later in life. Written in what the source describes as dubious English, the letter shows Kadosh expressing disillusionment with the sheer number of orders and titles he had accumulated.
What did he say?
He writes, "I am no more interested in great orders and societies, and no more I am fascinated by the many seals and more."
It sounds like he's tired of the organizational politics and perhaps the superficiality of collecting titles. And how does he sum up his situation?
It's a stark and rather tragic summary. After listing some of his remaining areas of focus, Rosicrucian, astrologer, alchemist, Kabbalist, he adds this poignant line, "Yes, many titles, charges, and patents I have, but only few pennies in the purse."
Few pennies in the purse. Oof. That single line perfectly captures the sense of a life dedicated to grand, invisible pursuits that ultimately failed to provide material security or perhaps lasting recognition or community.
It really does. It underscores the tragic dimension mentioned in a description by a Masonic brother quoted in the article: a life rich in fantasy and esoteric claims, but poor in material goods and likely in genuine, non-imaginary friends.
It's a common theme in the lives of many dedicated, perhaps overly ambitious occultists and alchemists throughout history.
Sadly, yes.
But the story doesn't end there. Part 5 brings us to the utterly unexpected twist: the return of the Master Builder, the Ben Kadosh Renaissance.
Exactly. The source circles back to how Kadosh might initially appear to a modern reader a somewhat laughable eccentric, whose writing is obscure, perhaps incompetent, bizarre, original, and difficult to follow.
Right, not exactly prime guru material on the surface.
Given that initial assessment, it truly is surprising, even remarkable, that a number of people today have taken a positive interest in his work, seeing something of value beneath the eccentricity.
And this positive interest culminated in the formation of a specific group dedicated to carrying on his current.
Yes, the Neo-Luciferian Church, or NLC, formed on Candlemas, February 2nd in 2005.
Neo-Luciferian Church.
Okay. Its founders were Michael Berchot, Bjarne Selling Petersen, and I.M. Berg. The source notes that the desire to re-establish a Danish Luciferian church and carry on the magical current from Carl William Hansen had existed within certain esoteric circles in Scandinavia since the 1970s.
Michael Berchot is a fairly well-known figure in modern esoteric circles, isn't he? Associated with voodoo gnosis and stuff.
He is, particularly in the context of thelema, left-hand path magic, and voodoo gnosis. He's the head of numerous organizations and is known for blending diverse traditions like voodoo, thelema, Martinism, and Gnosticism into complex systems. The source notes that while his system is broad and goes beyond the scope of this deep dive, Luciferian elements are present in his teachings, making him a logical figure to be involved in founding a group dedicated to Kadosh's legacy.
So how did Kadosh's very obscure, difficult-to-read work become known to these modern practitioners? How did they even find it?
A crucial step was the work of Bjarne Selling Petersen. He undertook the task of translating Kadosh's main pamphlet, Denny Morgan's Gry, into English.
The translation was key.
Absolutely. This translation was published in 1993 in the Swedish Satanist journal, the Fenris Wolf. This marked the first time Kadosh's key text was available to a wider audience outside of Danish.
So after his death in 1936, Kadosh's ideas didn't immediately gain traction, and even after the 1993 translation, it wasn't an overnight sensation.
Exactly. The source notes that he gained very few followers in his own lifetime, and the 1993 translation didn't immediately lead to a surge of interest. But his name did start circulating, becoming better known among Scandinavian esotericists, gradually preparing the ground for the formation of the NLC years later.
Like planting a seed. And the NLC has seen some growth since its founding. How big are they?
Yes. In 2006, a new edition of Kadosh's pamphlet was published in Danish, and a Swedish translation is currently in preparation, indicating ongoing interest in his work. The NLC has a small but active membership.
How small is small?
There are a handful of members in Denmark, and a Swedish congregation was recently established. The total membership remains small, estimated by the source to be around 10-20 people.
Okay, very niche.
Very. Membership is typically by invitation only, and members are often in their 30s or 40s, frequently with a university education, particularly in the humanities.
An academically inclined, niche, invitation-only group. That demographic makes sense for engaging with complex, obscure historical texts. Now, the source makes a very interesting observation about the NLC's relationship with Kadosh himself.
Yes, the article observes a strong cult of Kadosh's person within the NLC. However, precisely because he was such a rather ludicrous character in many ways.
The margarine hat guy.
Exactly. This devotion necessitates an ironical approach from his followers.
An ironic approach. What does that look like in practice for a religious or magical order? Sounds unusual?
It is unusual. The source provides some wonderfully specific examples drawn from the NLC's online merchandise store. They sell items that seem to poke fun, gently, at Kadosh's image and their own niche status.
Like what?
For example, you can buy coffee mugs and notebooks featuring Kadosh's photo, marketed specifically for the occult geek.
An occult geek coffee mug with the portrait of a long-dead Danish dairy salesman who tried to summon fire elementals. That is definitely not typical satanic branding.
Not at all, and there's more humor evident. The The store sells items like a satanic BBQ apron,
Okay.
a Neo-Luciferian cap of invisibility, presumably ironic,
Presumably.
and even anti-Christian boxer shorts. Their homepage features a line from one of the members that is similarly lighthearted. Come join the dark side, we've got cookies.
Come join the dark side, we've got cookies. Next to their statement of beliefs. This blend of deep esoteric claims and self-aware humor is quite striking and unusual for a group identifying as Satanic or Luciferian. It really is.
It sets them apart from the often rigidly serious tone of other such groups.
It absolutely does. But the source is careful to note that these humor and irony are a layer. They don't negate the underlying seriousness of the group.
Right, it's not just a joke.
No. For instance, the NLC pays for the upkeep of Kadosh's grave, demonstrating a tangible respect and commitment to his memory. And the source states that, despite the playful exterior, the NLC perceives Kadosh's ideas in deadly earnest. Their core Luciferian creed, for example, is described as being written in a typically bombastic, satanic style.
So the humor might be a way to engage, to build community, or to navigate the potential for ridicule given their founders' eccentricities. But the core spiritual commitment is genuine.
That seems to be the balance they strike.
How do the members themselves describe Kadosh's place within the church? Is he like a prophet? A
No.
saint? This source includes slightly different perspectives. Bjorn Salling Peterson, the translator of the pamphlet, states that Kadosh is no role as a special saint for the NLC, and that they are equally inspired by such people as Hermann Hesse, Bulwer Lytton, Aleister Crowley, or Eliphas Levi, plus dozens more.
So for Peterson, Kadosh is important, but he's just one figure in a pantheon of influential thinkers, part of a bigger picture.
Yes. However, another member, identified as Reverend Prophège, offers a slightly different emphasis, seeing Kadosh as one of our fathers and respected as a founder, albeit more in spirituality than in actual succession.
More symbolic founder than direct lineage holder.
Right. This suggests Kadosh holds a foundational position, even if there isn't a direct, unbroken line of hierarchical succession from him. The source highlights that even with Pedersen's view of multiple inspirations, the specific merchandise and focus on Kadosh indicate he occupies a unique central symbolic space within the NLC.
Which brings us perfectly to part 6, legitimizing Lucifer. Kadosh's strategic role for the NLC. The source asks a very practical question. What can a modern esoteric group gain from having a guru who died in 1936, especially one as obscure and eccentric as Kadosh?
Right. Why bother with this obscure figure?
Yeah.
In the context of Satanism, the answer is something incredibly valuable: historical tradition and legitimacy. The source reiterates the argument that systematic, text-based Satanism is relatively rare before the 20th century.
We talked about LaVey in 66.
Exactly. While you have figures like Stanislaw Przybyszewski around 1900 exploring philosophical Satanism, and LaVey establishing the Church of Satan in 1966, having Kadosh's pamphlet, Holy Writ, if you will, published in 1906, makes the NLC remarkably and uniquely grounded in tradition and history compared to most other modern satanic groups.
And the article makes a quite provocative claim based on this.
It does. It suggests that Kadosh's pamphlet could reasonably be said to be the very first consistently satanic esoteric text, specifically distinguishing it from more philosophical or literary forms of Satanism.
The first one. Wow.
This allows the NLC to make the bold and, the source suggests, accurate claim that they are the most traditional Satanist group in the world, because their foundational text is genuinely old and consistently focused on satanic teaching as a religious system.
So while the Church of Satan, founded in 1966, is often cited as the oldest currently existing Satanist group with an unbroken tradition, the NLC, by resurrecting Kadosh, can claim to represent a dormant but older tradition stretching back further than any other.
Precisely. It's a revival, not an unbroken lineage. But that 1906 pamphlet provides a tangible, verifiable historical anchor that is exceptional within the landscape of modern Satanism.
That makes sense as a claim to legitimacy.
However, the source is also clear that Kadosh is not the NLC's only source of inspiration or tradition.
Right, they read other stuff too. Their recommended reading list is extensive, encompassing a wide range of Western occultism.
Yes, it includes a general study in the Western occult tradition, with authors like Eliphas Levi, Michael Berchot, Dion Fortune, S. McGregor Mathers, Israel Regardie, Aleister Crowley, Francis King, Kenneth Grant, and Austin Osman Spare. This shows they draw on a much broader pool of influences.
And Aleister Crowley, the infamous beast 6666, seems particularly important to them.
Very important. The source notes that the NLC's homepage features 20 of Crowley's texts translated into Danish.
20 texts, that's a lot.
It is. And his most famous dictum, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is a law, love under will," is displayed prominently on their front page, decorated with the Crowleyan universal hexagram.
That's a clear indication that while Kadosh is a founder figure, his teachings have been significantly modified and added to by incorporating elements from other traditions, particularly Crowley's Thelema.
Naturally, as the source points out, Kadosh's total extant writings amount to only about 49 small pages across his 2 pamphlets.
49 pages isn't much to build a whole religion on.
No, that's a rather slim canon for any religion to rely on exclusively. So incorporating other sources is essential for building a comprehensive system.
It's almost surprising, then, that the source notes there are relatively few explicit references to Kadosh's writings on the NLC homepage itself.
The source highlights this. Only one direct quote from Denny Morgan's Gry appears in their manifesto. In contrast, there are more explicit references to Crowley, Albert Pike,
the Mason.
Yes, the prominent American Mason and esotericist, and Charles G. Leland, author of Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches, and Eliphas Levi. This raises the question of how much of Kadosh's specific, unique theology is actually central to their public ideology.
Are there any subtle ideological echoes of Kadosh's specific ideas in their material, things that sound like him?
The source suggests some possibilities, particularly in the Neo-Luciferian Manifesto and the Neo-Luciferian Creed. For example, describing Lucifer as a personified as well as abstract reality echoes Kadosh's definition of Lucifer as both personal and impersonal.
Okay, that sounds similar.
Also, calling Lucifer the deity of freedom and a natural enemy towards them that enslaves man and beast, having some element of rebellion and anarchy, a kind of civil disobedience against claimed authorities, is similar to Kadosh's view of Lucifer opposing the church and ignorance.
But as the source is careful to note, these are general enough concepts within Luciferianism or esoteric thought that they don't necessarily prove direct, explicit influence from Kadosh's specific formulations.
Exactly. Bjorn Selling-Pedersen's comment about looking for Kadosh in NLC material being like looking for a ghost because Kadosh's work ain't exactly filled with plain statements suited for quotation is illuminating here.
Hard to quote obscure, muddled language.
Right. It suggests Kadosh's influence is less about quotable dogma and more about providing a foundational spirit or current. Reverend Proprafige's view that Kadosh's influence is more ideological and ritualistic, seen in their rites, ceremonies, consecrations, and overall statement of faith, seems to align with this.
So, if his specific ideas aren't always explicitly quoted, what is Kadosh's primary function for the NLC, especially to the outside world? Why keep bringing him up?
The source concludes that Kadosh's main function for the NLC, at least the one most visible externally, is mostly as a link to history. He is primarily a strategic tool employed to underline the authenticity, legitimacy, and high age of the spiritual current represented by the NLC.
It's all about that historical connection. This strategy of claiming historical lineage and tradition is incredibly important in the esoteric milieu, isn't it?
Absolutely central.
It's a way of establishing authority in a landscape, often filled with competing claims of unique revelations or personal gnosis.
It is. And the NLC takes it to an extraordinary degree. They meticulously document their claimed succession lines from no less than 21 different churches.
21, including?
These include various Gnostic magical lineages, but remarkably also include traditional Christian churches like the Russian Orthodox Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church.
Claiming lineage from traditional Christian churches for a Luciferian group seemed like a very deliberate and perhaps audacious maneuver to establish legitimacy.
It absolutely highlights the great importance attached within the NLC to tradition and ancient lineages as a means to create legitimacy, which the source notes is a very typical characteristic of the esoteric world.
Right.
In this context, Kadosh, with his 1906 pamphlet and documented existence, is yet another such instrument, providing a relatively early tangible point in the lineage.
The source brings in James R. Lewis's framework for how new religions legitimate themselves, listing charisma, rational appeals, and traditional appeals. How does the NLC fit?
It applies effectively to the NLC. Kadosh, even though deceased, serves as a figure possessing charisma as a visionary founder.
Charisma from beyond the grave.
Kind of. Rationality isn't overtly emphasized by the NLC as a primary appeal, though they don't reject it, but tradition is extremely prominent, leveraged through their extensive lineage claims and, critically, through Kadosh's age and his early text.
And you mentioned earlier why Kadosh's specific age, 1906, is so significant in the context of Satanism.
Yes. Lewis suggests a deep, culturally transmitted pattern where ancient origins are seen as particularly sacred, while other Satanist groups might claim symbolic links to ancient cultures like Egypt or Sumeria.
Right, vague, ancient stuff.
This source argues that for actual Satanism, meaning a religious system consciously centered on venerating or working with the figure of the devil Satan Lucifer Ben Kadosh, is as ancient as it gets in terms of documented text-based expressions. He provides a uniquely early, though obscure, historical anchor.
It's a different approach than, say, LaVey's Church of Satan initially took.
Yes, LaVey's COS initially leaned more on rational and secularist appeals, framing Satanism as a practical philosophy blending science, psychology, and magic.
More modern, less traditional focus at first.
Right. While the Church of Satan's emphasis shifted somewhat towards tradition after LaVey's death, with his writings becoming quasi-scriptural texts, the NLC uses Kadosh in a more fluid, less dogmatic way. As the source notes, their creed is presented as a work thesis rather than a dogmatic comprehension of reality.
So they're not treating Kadosh's obscure 1906 pamphlet as a rigid, untouchable Bible. They're using it as a historical source and inspiration point.
Correct. But even with this flexibility, the strategic importance of tradition is clear. The source quotes scholar Olaf Hammer, who points out that the construction of tradition is indeed a question of taking the right to speak authoritatively.
So claiming tradition gives you the right to speak.
Essentially, using tradition is an ideological maneuver, even if the interpretation is soft as silk and applied without much force.
So simply being able to point to a text from 1906 gives the NLC a certain authoritative position within the modern satanic landscape, allowing them to claim historical depth.
Exactly. Hammer also observes that while direct references to older esoteric writers have decreased in some parts of modern esotericism, this is not true for the specific segment that Michael Berchot, Kenneth Grant, and the NLC belong to.
They still value those direct links.
Yes, these groups actively build legitimacy on claiming direct links and succession from earlier figures. The NLC, in this sense, is taking an old-fashioned but effective approach to establishing its bona fides.
Besides tradition, the source briefly mentions other potential strategies they might use.
Yes, vague references to experience, rationality, and science are present in the NLC's approach, but the source reiterates that tradition, especially through Kadosh and their lineage claims, is the most visible and emphasized strategy.
Okay.
Finally, the NLC creed mentions secret chiefs or hidden masters, and the idea that prophets arise from having contact with non-human intelligence.
The secret chiefs concept, common in some esoteric groups.
Right. While Kadosh isn't explicitly named in this context, he can implicitly be assumed to be one such prophet in their worldview, adding another layer of esoteric authority, direct contact with higher hidden powers beyond mere historical lineage.
Adding a mystical, almost revelatory dimension to his founder status.
To conclude, Part 7 sums up our deep dive into Ben Kadosh. Contrary to the common narrative that systematic Satanism is a recent phenomenon, William Hansen, writing as Ben Kadosh, was indeed an early, highly eccentric and deeply original figure who attempted to create a systematic satanic teaching long before LaVey.
His system was a strange but fascinating blend of Gnosticism, Masonic reinterpretation, pan-worship, vitalistic ideas, alchemy, and his own unique, often obscure interpretations. His life was equally strange, full of grand claims, attempts at practical magic, peculiar contacts, limited practical success, and a degree of public notoriety, with fiction even playing a role in preserving his unusual legend.
And the unexpected renaissance of his ideas comes with the Neo-Luciferian Church. They have resurrected his legacy, using his 1906 pamphlet and his figure strategically to establish historical roots and legitimacy for their modern movement.
And that movement has this unique style.
Yes, blending deep, earnestly held esoteric claims with a surprising, self-aware amount of ironic humor.
The source's exploration of Kadosh's case is significant because it suggests a potential openness to systematic Satanism in the esoteric milieu of his era that might have been underestimated.
Right, maybe he wasn't entirely alone.
It implies that more such figures might exist, awaiting discovery, potentially offering new historical anchors for modern esoteric groups seeking to claim a longer, deeper tradition than previously thought possible within the satanic current.
Kadosh provides a concrete, verifiable, albeit peculiar point of origin that groups like the NLC can point to, offering a form of legitimacy that goes beyond vague claims about ancient witch cults or imaginary hereditary traditions.
So what does this entire strange case of Ben Kadosh and his unexpected renaissance really tell us? What's the final thought here?
Well, I think it serves as a vivid illustration of how historical figures, no matter how obscure, eccentric, or even seemingly ludicrous they might have appeared in their own time, can be resurrected, reinterpreted, and strategically repurposed by later movements seeking to build identity, claim legitimacy, and establish a connection to a usable past.
It makes you consider what truly grants authority or authenticity to a spiritual or esoteric tradition.
Hmm.
Is in an unbroken lineage, the verifiable age of its founding texts, the personal charisma of its leaders, even if experienced posthumously.
Or maybe the ability to weave a compelling narrative.
Yeah, even one that audaciously blends deep esoteric claims with a modern sensibility, including the ironic humor we saw with the NLC. What does this unique mix in the NLC, built on the foundation of a early 20th century Danish dairy salesman alchemist, reflect about how tradition is constructed and perceived in contemporary spiritual subcultures?
It definitely leaves you with a lot to ponder about history, belief, and these strange paths people forge through the darkness towards their own conception of light. How groups build meaning and authority, whether it's an ancient faith or, a modern group finding roots in someone like Ben Kadosh from 1906.